questions that I may just those your work.
That's how I use questions anyway, so it'll work well for me.
No matter what you're asked, right? I mean, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Your background is in English literature and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
How did you end up being a producer, and what moved you to work on your documentary "Pray the Devil Back to Hell"? Well,
the seeds for the documentary were sort of planted by my PhD dissertation, which was on American war novels. I was very interested in war novels because I was interested in masculinity and the way it figures into literature and the way men talk about themselves when they think we're not listening. And war novels are a little bit like a locker room conversation. They really are. I mean, there's a presumption that women don't care and won't read them. So it really is a good place to go and sort of like understand, you know, how they talk about the project of being a man in the world and making meaning. So, so I read, you know, everything you could read and then some. And what interested me at the time was just the way there were no women. There are just no women. You know, if you go back to the Iliad and you read, you know, all of the, you know, basic war texts, you know, they're there around the edges. They're the mothers who say goodbye. They're the girlfriends, you know, who greet them when they come home. They're the hookers, always the hookers. Actually, hooker was the name of a Civil War general. That's where the word hooker came from. But other than that, you know, the rank and file of civilian woman isn't there. And, you know, it just, that kind of stuck with me for a really long time. And years later, when I went to Liberia and I found this story and started working with Ginny and then Pam to make the films, this came back to me. And it was just interesting because if you think about it, if there's such a thing as, for instance, house-to-house fighting, people lived in those houses. Where did they go? They didn't evaporate into thin air. They're somewhere. Something's happened, you know? And it started to sink into me that, oh, you know, whenever I see a war film, it's actually mostly combat. But war is actually something much larger than that. And, you know, many soldiers are sort of famous for saying that combat is actually all war is 1% terror and 99% boredom, because war is bigger than the combat. Right? And it's this social phenomenon that takes over every aspect. So where are these women and what's happening to them? So that was kind of my evolution into wanting to make this series with my partners, Ginny Rediker and Pamela Hogan, who were in their way also asking themselves the same set of questions. And I happened to go to Liberia and I happened to hear that story. I went for other reasons. Really didn't want to make movies. That was something my family did, and I kind of didn't want to do it. But it was just the only right thing to do once I knew the story. It was just, it had to be told. So in a way, it's like you're giving voice to the feminine. I mean, you sense the way of how the feminine, and I'm not only talking about women, I'm also talking about what the feminine represents. Yeah, yeah. And you are being the vehicle. Right. Right. And also, it's very important to make these voices heard. There's a reason they're not in these landscapes, I think. And that is that if you actually look at the war through a woman's eyes, if you really make that woman visible, that woman who's, you know, hiding in the root cellar and the bombs are hitting the top of her house and she's praying that she lives through the shelling, or, you know, if you make that woman visible and you look at what we call heroism and what we describe as, you know, as the kind of greatness of combat, the beauty of it just falls away. It can't withstand that gaze. So we don't have them on landscapes when we're talking about heroism, because heroism really starts to feel really empty and meaningless when we have them there. Right. It's more like a masculine thing, right? Yeah. And what moved you to, I mean, because from that documentary you moved into the War and Peace series. Yeah. So it's kind of the same. Yeah, it really, one thing flowed into the next. When we started Pray the Devil Back to Hell, there was no idea that we'd make this series, but when we opened at Tribeca, by that time we'd been having this conversation with Pam Hogan at WNET, and it just, the one thing just flowed right into the next, almost like seamlessly. Yeah. Your work has concentrated in women, and how
war impacts their lives. What have you learned about resilience and the power of women?
Yeah, well, the question of how we're covering it is half how war affects women, but also how women affect war, because actually it is a two-way street, you know. So the first thing that happens is you don't see objects anymore, you see subjects, right? These women stop being sort of passive, helpless creatures lying by the side of the road asking someone to help them, and they morph into, oh, people with histories and ideas and personalities and senses of humor who are actively looking for food, looking for firewood, trying to figure out the water situation, sensing patterns of where the weapons are going and who's doing the fighting and why. They are very active and engaged in that war scenario, and they're trying to influence their husbands, they're trying to influence them. And some of them are stepping up and fighting too. I mean, it's not like we're all saints, and you know, and it's not like every man is anxious to fight either. So, but generally speaking, they do have an influence over this thing that happens in wartime, and you know, we ignore their role to our peril. Partly because when they step up and argue for peace, you know, it's really interesting. They get dismissed as a special interest groups, but they're never asking for what benefits women. They're asking for what benefits everybody. Because what they do in almost any society, ours and any of the countries that are currently in conflicts, is they're in charge of the newborn life and taking care of the sick and the old and the disabled, and they are in charge of the water and the food and the education and the shelter. Peace is what they need to be good at their jobs. So when they step up and want to be part of peace processes, what they bring with them is everything that we lump into this big category we call life. You know, the business and the activities involved in making a life in a place.
I see. Yeah, it's like Muhammad Yunus said once that he's more inclined to help women because they will care about, you know,
right.
the community, not only themselves. In your series, Women, War and Peace, you covered the Colombian Civil War. Have you thought of covering the war against drugs that is currently taking place in Mexico?
You know, if what's going on in Mexico now were declared an active conflict, it would be one of the highest fatality rates in the world. There are more people dying in Mexico now than civilians than died in Afghanistan last year. So it's very much like a conflict. And what's happening in the 21st century is what is a war is getting more and more difficult to define, because so many people are so well armed, so well resourced, and so much woven into communities. It's just blurred all sense of war. So, you know, we have had literally millennia of no women, no talk of women, no discussion of their role, no discussion of, so in this one series we couldn't possibly, sadly, cover everything. And so all we do all the time is wish we could cover Mexico, wish we could talk about Israel, wish we could talk about Chechnya and Mindanao and Nepal and Guatemala and on and on. I wish I could cover so many more wars, but we had 5 hours, and films are small, you know? That's a kind of, we forget that they're like little jewelry boxes and they only hold so much. And like if you have an emotional moment, you need time, you know, to breathe around that moment. You need time to develop a real emotional investment in characters and so forth. So it was an early decision to go deep instead of wide. And so we want these to be the beginnings of conversations. We want these to start the ball rolling so that, you know, so hopefully other filmmakers will pick up and talk about Mexico. We'll talk about all these other conflicts.
Or you continue another, you know, series.
Yeah.
Maybe. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. I mean, that situation is just has my heart.
Yeah. Your work places women at the center of the dialogue about conflict and security. It seems to me also that we mentioned already this question about how the feminine contains the hope and the power to make change. You were saying that war, it takes place from the masculine side, but when women intervene is when everything starts to change.
Right. You always run the risk in a project like this of a man bad, woman good kind of dialectic. And that's not the case, and that's certainly not demonstrable, from the evidence. There are plenty of women out there rooting for the conflicts. There are plenty of men out there wishing they'd stop and actively pursuing the end of them. So I don't think it's necessarily a question of like women automatically fix the situation or always are aligned with peace. But I do think it's really important to also note that for millennia, one group of us, has consistently picked up the weapons and started the fight. And one group of us has consistently not, as a matter of general principle. And there really just is no more gender-determined human activity, or I can't think of one, than war. So when women do come in significant numbers, in critical mass, into leadership and into the public space to have a conversation about, like, why would we fight? And would it be worth it to us to do so? They're less invested in the systems that benefit by the fight. They're not at corporations that make money from it. They're not at the tops of governments that are having the conflicts. So they aren't likely to be rewarded by the war. And they are, of course, heavily populating the very people who, have the most to lose. So generally speaking, they're going to be the people in critical mass who will want most greatly and articulate that call for peace that generally benefits, the rank and file.